Why is breach inevitable? Breach is inevitable because we have data. We have data that people want. But why we're here today is to talk about the reality of what the attackers that are trying to get your data are doing, and maybe shatter a few illusions. We've all heard the term before, advanced persistent threat. We've probably also heard the term sophisticated attackers, or as I like to call them, moderately skilled people who know more about your network than you do. Because this is the reality of how breaches are happening. A lot of what you see in the news, a lot of the big breaches, these things are coming not from extremely sophisticated actors doing highly advanced things, but from the least common denominator way to get into your network. And they get in a lot of the time because a lot of these things are available to them. But there's also been a lot of changes to how the attackers are working nowadays. Because it used to be, we would think about the kill chain. We would think about historically how someone would get into your network. They would come in, they'd be on the network for 225 to 150 days, depending on which day of the week we're talking to you. They would hang out, they would be there, and they would be quiet. They didn't want to disrupt your actions at all. But now we have a new type of cyber kill chain, one that's coming up a lot and is almost as profitable as doing it the other way. This cyber kill chain goes like this. I get into your network, I hang out for a little bit, and then I smack you in the face. Because this is what's known as cyber extortion. And I know you've already heard this term this week. But cyber extortion can range from anything from ransomware to someone who's been in your network threatening to sell data. Because if I can get into a network and you don't notice me, and I can find out a little bit about your network, there's value in there. There may be value not just in attacking you in and of yourself. There could be value in finding out about your network and selling it to other people. If I can get into a network and do a tiny bit of reconnaissance, I might be able to make a little bit of profit and not actually have done all that much too illegal on your network. Because that's what they can do, is if you're an aerospace company or a power plant or maybe a large software company, people want to know how your network is set up so that they can do things against you. We're going to walk through a couple case studies today. You might have heard recently about the Internet of Toasters. Those are those toasters, those IoT devices that are taking down websites. That's a good indicator of how the skill level has been reduced to cause disruption in an environment. So if we think about disruption, cyber extortion, or plain old espionage, you're probably thinking James Bond. You're probably thinking Q. I'm thinking a kid in a hoodie in his grandmother's basement. Because let's talk about how you would cripple a power plant. I want to take down a power plant. Maybe I don't like your country. Maybe I don't like the type of power you are. This has happened a few times, so this is a true story. If I were in the audience and I wanted to take down a power plant, would I A, use a super sophisticated zero-day exploit? Would I B, use some sort of hardware-based attack, maybe get into their routers? Would I use a never-seen exploit on a website before? Or would I D, get a guy running his admin to open an Excel book, click on enable macros? I would do D, because that is exactly what happened. If you can get somebody to click on enable macros, what you're actually having them do is click on the option for enable command prompt for attacker. Because that is what the macros inside of Microsoft Office are. They enable you to have a wide range of command prompt and VB script actions that you can perform on there. And if you are allowing people to enable macros, you are allowing the attacker to do a lot of things in your environment. There's a lot of different interfaces they can get to. They could flat out run a batch file if they wanted to. So this guy, he clicked on enable macros with a screenshot that actually has macros spelled wrong in every single language that they make this in. But they clicked on enable macros. It executed a VB script. It downloaded a utility from a website. It started to wipe the systems in the power plant, and it was game over. There was nothing sophisticated there. The script was downloaded from a website. It was already pre-built by someone else, as was the wiping utility. But they were able to take down an entire utility plant simply from an end user running as admin, clicking that button. And that's the reality we live in. And that's why I always show that typical attack chain. Because when they get in and they have that first machine with the malware, they do their recon and they spread about the network. That's when I talk about the breach, assume breach. Every one of those workstations is untrusted to you. But what we want to talk about today is, what do we mean by malware? Because malware, you're probably sitting there thinking about something written very sophisticated, custom compiled code, maybe super secret, maybe it has a no day in it, all those cool words you read in advertisements for widgets. But I'm talking about .hta, .js, and OLE. I'm talking about batch files. Because that is just as effective for an attacker. It's a great way to slip through a mail system. And unlike some of those more sophisticated languages like PowerShell, if you use VB, there is no log. If I use PowerShell, there's a log of the capabilities of what I've done. I can enable command prompt logging. If I do one of these, I can sail into your system and leave no forensic evidence. So not only is it easier to get in, not blocked by most systems, it also has a lot of benefit if you're trying to hide what you're doing. So this is really kind of not being a sophisticated attacker. This is being as dumb as you can get in order to get into the network. And that's the idea where you get into the network, because authenticated users, those people can do a large amount of recon in your environment. If I can get in as an authenticated user, I can do a little bit about what I talked about yesterday and find out who's in all the admin groups. Or more importantly, if I get in as an authenticated user, I might be able to figure out right away where your database of important information lives. Or maybe I can read their email and figure that out. Or maybe that authenticated user is showing me that we're merging with a company. But beyond that slide with a typical attack, if you've seen it before, we talk about elevating privileges to capture the credentials. And that's typically what we think about. We think about someone uses a vulnerability, they exploit win32k.sys, a driver in Windows that is very popular with hackers, in order to get system-level privileges. And they do that so that they can embrace a different kind of Kiwi, and that would be a gentle Kiwi known as Benjamin Delpy. Benjamin Delpy wrote a utility called Mimikatz, which commoditized a lot of what you can do as a hacker, because it allows you to steal credentials from a lot of different sources. You can steal credentials, whether they be from Kerberos, NTLM, the local secrets, or he recently figured out how to do smart cards and capture the PIN. He also has a utility inside of his tool to do something called hot patching of event logs. Once again, commoditizing something that used to be very hard. Because if you can hot patch an event log, you're not wiping the log, you've shimmed your own code into the process that's running and are preventing logs from writing. But that's where you have to have elevated as an admin. So either you have to get somebody who's running as admin to do what you want with Mimikatz, or you have to take care of a vulnerability that will allow you to elevate to system-level privileges. Because those things we patch every month, where you see win32k.sys, elevation of privilege, that's where somebody running as a non-admin is able to take advantage of a problem in our code, or in Adobe's code, and go ahead and get to system-level access on that machine. So there's important things to think of here. But if I can get in as just an authenticated user, forget about elevating for a minute. Maybe there's no way that I can elevate, or maybe they're not running as admin. I can do recon. I can figure out who's in those groups. I can start to do a lot of what I need to do. I can see what's on your systems as far as logging policies. I can look at group policy. I can see what your audit policies look like. I can see what you're doing. Are you sending to a Windows event forwarding collector? Are you watching things at all? I can do what's called an SPN scan. SPNs, those are service principal names. That's how you do Kerberos authentication to certain services in your environment. IIS will have an HTTPS SPN, SQL will have an MS SQL, all those different ones like that. I do that for two reasons if I'm an attacker. One, I figure out where the SQL server is, but two, I can do something called Kerberosting. So Kerberosting is a technique that takes advantage of the fact that Kerberos is very polite. If you ask it for something, it will give it to you. So if I tell it, I'm pretty certain that I am the SQL server. Can I have a ticket? It will hand you the hash of that password. And if that password is insufficiently long or complex, or frankly, even if it is and you have a supercomputer somewhere, you can then crack that offline. How many of you have a service account in your domain admins? Some of you are probably not raising your hand, but some of you probably have it there. Or if nothing else, you've got a service account that has access to something. How about your SCOM service account? SCOM has an SPN, and SCOM is running as an agent on every single system in your environment. And the agent is probably running as local admin on the SCOM server. If I can get in as an authenticated user, and I can do an SPN query, and I can get that hash, and that hash is not sufficiently complex, and I can run it through something called OCL Hashcrack, and I've got a couple of beefy little graphics cards in my machine, I went from end user to total domain compromise in a matter of 24 hours to a week, depending on how long it takes to crack it. So that's what I mean about assume breach, and think about the attacker being in your network. Because where those accounts have access to, even if they're not a domain admin today, think about it. If somebody can query an SPN, figure out where it is, and get the password, they can have access to that system very, very quickly. But let's say that I haven't elevated, and I would like to get your domain admin credentials. And let's say that you're not using a privileged admin workstation. There's a good chance that you probably have either RDP'd into something as your privileged account, or maybe mapped a drive. So you would probably go ahead and type your credentials into these windows, right? Those aren't the real windows. Those are a cross-site scripting version of those windows, which have been used in the wild by attackers. Because if your everyday practice is to let your administrators use the same physical device for admin work and web browsing, they're going to be able to figure that out. A great many of what are called exploit kits, those are the things that get embedded into advertising networks and websites and deliver malware like ransomware to you. A lot of those exploit kits can figure out who's logged on. And if you've logged on with a run as your domain admin account to launch Active Directory users and computers, you're logged in fully interactively to that machine as well. So I can just ask you for your creds, and you'll give them to me. That's historically proven for a lot of cases. Because really, what we're looking at here, when we think about these sophisticated attackers who are getting into really important networks, is we're partying like it's 1997. We haven't even made it to 99 yet. Because if I can utilize all of those legacy pieces that are out there, one, they still work, and they still work really well, but two, they don't have all the capabilities for logging that the new technology has. If I can utilize these things, even if you have PowerShell 5 on in your environment and you've disabled PowerShell 2 so nobody can do a downgrade, and you've got all that running so that you're doing all that full logging of PowerShell, I'm going to run a batch file, because nobody sees that. So that's what we need to think about, is think about them getting into your network as an authenticated user through downright boring means, and then getting to what they need. This is the Macrosys macro. That is actually what it says. This is from a kit that you can get to build your own malware. So there are lots and lots of varieties of malware that have the Macrosys typo in it. The Macrosys we're going to walk through in this case right here was able to take over something in the healthcare industry because somebody clicked on Enable Macrosys. So they opened up an attachment on a shared kiosk machine. This shared kiosk machine, due to the nature of whatever application they were using, was logged in as an admin. It was always logged in as an admin. It was running in the background. So when they opened this from their webmail interface, it was running as admin. That makes it a lot easier for the attacker. By enabling their macros, or Macrosys, it executed a VB script. So in that instance, it executed VB. But what it did is it connected to something called a command and control server, a server that serves up malware. So the attacker knew that somebody at Organization Z, I said Z, I'm very proud of myself. Thank you. Organization Z, which they have been looking to get into for some time. They've been doing what's called a spear phishing campaign, sending those targeted emails to them. So they knew Organization Z had checked in. So now that they had that IP address range of Organization Z, they sent down a payload. And the payload in this instance was PowerShell. It was a PowerShell backdoor. So the entire piece of malware that was executing there and persisting on that machine was actually PowerShell. And what it did is, since it was already running as admin, it was able to use Benjamin's invoke Mimikatz, with a little help from Joe Bialik, who wrote the invoke part, and it was able to get the credentials of an admin user. It was then able to figure out a service account credential. It most likely did an SPN scan and Kerberos did. We didn't get that data, but that's probably what it did. And then it moved unfettered across the network, doing whatever it wants, using all built-in admin tools. From there on out, it did what's called living off the land. Because if it can do things that are built in, that's a lot better. Because if you don't bring tools, you can kind of hide a little bit better. So you had total domain compromise from Word. An entire domain with very interesting data compromised from one Word attachment. And that's really, really, really common. So just a few more examples of that, just things that people click on that have led to major compromises. So manage your macros. There are GPOs. I have good news for once. There are GPOs that can help you manage these. There's something called trusted locations. If you can't outright disable macros, trusted locations says that that finance macro that Bob in accounting wrote, it can run if it runs from this location, but macrosys can't run. And then just recently, we backported something that we'd done in Office 2016 to Office 2013, just a little bit backported, where if it's from an internet source, you can't run the macro. This is important because a lot of times people leave this enable command prompt for the attacker vector open because it's a mission critical application. They need that macro for finance or whatever, especially small businesses. So there are ways to not outright disable macros, but still stop that vector from getting into your environment. And that's why we need holistic security strategies, because we need to think that somebody is going to get in there, because the user is the DMZ. If they can click on that, and they will, they're going to be able to get in. Because 63% of malware infections last year required user infection or interaction of some kind. Whether that would be a .js file or a .hta or something like that came in, somebody interacted with it. We are not looking at sophisticated zero-day drive-by attacks for most of these things. Someone is doing something to get that malware. A big vector is keygens. If you were a teenager in the 90s, you probably used at least one keygen, and it probably played cute music in the background. But a lot of big corporate organizations, for some odd reason, people think they want to pirate Photoshop. And when they pirate Photoshop, it brings a special surprise, because that keygen has malware in it. Malware that can lead to one of those sophisticated attackers that'll exfiltrate your data and do lots and lots of nefarious things. That's the type of stuff that happens on a network that leads to serious, serious news-making type compromises. And that's what you have to think about. How do I build a security strategy when breach is inevitable? It's always going to happen. And that's where we have to think about the components of our holistic security strategy. In our world, this contains credential hygiene, making sure admins can't log into the same workstations that they do web browsing from, so that should malware get on that system, or should an admin that works at the help desk go rogue, they can't get the data off of that system. The other thing we talk about is network segmentation, which I did a session on yesterday. Network segmentation in our world is not necessarily running out and buying a whole bunch of new switches and firewalls and physical things. It's about the host-based firewall. And then you can do identity-based firewall rules to make sure that the people who have access to the data are network segmented from it. Least privilege. Do you really need to be running that as admin? Do you really need to have Bob in accounting be an admin? What's wrong with your app that's making it run that way? What's wrong with your person that you're letting your SharePoint admin have access to your secret government data and then taking it away? That's the type of thing we mean by least privilege. Start to assess that, because you're assuming that someone's going to get in and be able to find at least one account. Not all attackers are after domain admin. We've done a lot of talking at Microsoft about protecting domain admin. That's swell, because you really should protect domain admin. But don't stop there, because there are a lot of attackers who couldn't care less if you've protected domain admin. They're still going to be able to get in, and they're still going to be able to do recon. So start at the top, but keep working your way down. Least privilege does not stop with an empty domain admins group and privilege admin workstations. It has to keep going. Your help desk has to be managed. The way that you access machines remotely have to be managed, your service accounts, so on and so forth. And targeted monitoring. Monitoring is not easy. That's why I did a session at Australia last year on it. Because monitoring your systems for most people means stick an agent on it, running as domain admin, and then gather all of the data and never look at it, and have no idea what you're actually looking at there. Because how many of you know what event ID 1102 is? That is event logs have been cleared. If you are not monitoring event ID 1102 in your environment for your security log, the attacker is going to know that, and they're just going to clear the log, because then you won't know they were there. So know what you're monitoring and why is very important. That's what we mean by the targeted monitoring portion of that. Because that breach being inevitable means someone's going to get in and do that sort of thing. And just like I mentioned yesterday, your goal is to not to stop the attacker, but to kind of irritate them and slow them down. Because the attacker is going to be able to get in. If you are sufficiently interesting, maybe they will burn a zero-day exploit on you. Maybe they will write something new. They're going to get that first machine. You have to make lots and lots of little speed humps in front of them and keep them from doing what they need to do quickly so that they can make some noise in your environment and you can start to notice them. Because what we have nowadays is a security arms race. Anytime we build something, someone's going to figure out how we built it and how to get around it. That's normal, that's fine, doesn't mean anybody's bad at their job. That's just how things work. This is literally something like an arms race. Because every time we build a defense, there are highly motivated financially and politically people all around the world who want to get around it. So even if you build something really, really awesome, think about, fighter planes in the 50s and fighter planes today, right? There's going to be developments in this technology going forward. So you have to try to make yourself as robust as possible, knowing that some of the sheep will fall. If you've dealt with Microsoft security for a long time, this kind of ties into the security arms race, because you may be familiar with something we call the 10 immutable laws of security. Different things like weak passwords trump bad security, different laws like that. But in reality, if you think like an attacker, which is what I want you guys to start doing, if you think like an attacker, these are really the 10 omnipresent attack vectors. Because any one of those things that are there is something that doesn't have to be fixed, right? If a bad guy can persuade you to run your program, it's not your computer anymore. That's what macros are, right? So every one of these things, if you're thinking like an attacker, there's nothing wrong with the 10 immutable laws of security, but look at them through an attacker's mindset. And every one of those things, encrypted data is only as secure as the decryption key. Think like an attacker, and you think, they have a load balancer on their network. I bet that has the SSL private key for everything in the environment, and I bet it's not managed as strongly as domain admin. I bet that that network admin has a shared root password for that network load balancer. And suddenly, they have access to everything in your environment. That's how you have to look at these things. Look at them not just as ways to think about defenses, but if you look at the rules of security as an attacker, you start to see where things fall down. Because in the words of a very smart man named John Lambert, attackers think in graphs, not in lists. So they think, if I can get access to this one thing, it enables me to get access to all of these. So looking at only as secure as its decryption key, get access to that decryption key, get access to the data. Think about WAN optimization devices. WAN optimization devices have to be able to decrypt data to enable it. What happens if you get root on a WAN optimization device? That's the kind of thing. Because there's a really important thing to think about. When attackers are looking at these rules, they're not seeing them as security boundaries, because attackers don't care about security boundaries. When you hear UAC is not a security boundary as a reason that a bypass doesn't matter, the attacker is hearing, I'm going to keep bypassing UAC because it's useful to me. Because if you think about the rules, these are people who don't follow rules. They're obviously breaking the rules to get into your environment. So anything that works unexpectedly and is difficult to fix or won't be fixed is going to be an omnipresent attack vector to them. And that's a really important mindset shift that you need to be able to start to think like. And I don't teach you these things because I want you to be attackers. I want you to be able to think like an attacker when you're defending your network. Another attack vector that's really old that goes with that attack boundaries thing is thinking about OLE. So if you look at this document here, this totally legit email, which I got from a guy named Kevin Beaumont. That's a Word document, right? Are we nodding? Are we nodding? That is not a Word document. That is an exe that opens a command prompt, because OLE is an embedded object inside of an Office document, so that you can embed anything you want in there, and it will sail through most mail filters. So if you've got a very fancy device at your perimeter that would normally strip EXEs, PS1s, all those different things like that, if I can embed it as an OLE object, I'm going to get into your network, and someone will open that totally legit document, thinking it's a document. And this is real, and this has been used, and this will continue to be used. So we want to think about that sort of thing. How can something that's not really obvious and legacy and difficult to fix be utilized? Another one I like inside of Outlook, malicious Outlook rules. So there's a really cool thing that exists inside of Outlook where when you get a certain email, it will run executable code for you. I don't know why that's there. I'm sure someone had a reason for it. Now, in theory, that's supposed to mean that when you run that executable code, it can't be run off a share, it can't be a command line, different things like that. In my experiments, it actually works perfectly fine from a share, and you can run things like invoke mimikatz through it. And the other thing about this is there is no scale detection for this. There's literally no API that you can go around and check an entire organization for this type of thing. So that makes it potentially attractive to attackers. We don't have a lot of data on this one. It was just recently talked about at DerbyCon, but we don't have a lot of data on it because there's not a lot of good ways to look for it. And that's what's going to make an attack vector potentially really interesting to someone who wants to stay hidden. Because if I can do something that's really difficult to find, that's helpful because I might be able to stay in your environment longer. And that's really what we see, is that the attackers are learning how we detect things. We look for auto-start execution or extensibility points in incident response. All IR companies do. If you can find a new auto-start execution point that nobody's looking for, or maybe a sub-key to one that they're not picking up yet, or a new way to load code, that means that even if they hire a world-class incident response company, they know you're there because a 3-letter government agency has told them that you're there, they're going to scan your environment and not find you. Or maybe they'll find a false flag, right? So we have to keep up to date on these things as security professionals or security people and as defenders as well, because it's always going to be a security arms race there. And I have a whole slide dedicated to a person who's a little bit of a thorn in our side in spite of being a very nice guy, and his name is Casey Smith. Because what Casey can do is he can take every single built-in part of Windows and figure out how to do evil things with it. So Casey works at a really cool place where they do what's called adaptive threat divisioning, where they look and try to do new stuff. But he was working previously at a place that had done everything right. Think about the best practices customer, if you will. They had AppLocker, they had Device Guard, they had all of it to the nines. But he's on the red team. He has to figure out how to get in because he's in an industry that people are trying to get in. And he figured out that if he was able to use some built-in technology of Windows, he was able to bypass AppLocker. So even though all of these machines in his environment were saying you are not allowed to run arbitrary code, if he used Regsurf 32, he could execute arbitrary code in his environment. And that's the type of people that you're dealing with, developing new auto-start extensibility points and new ways to run code and new bypasses. Casey's great. I'm actually complimenting here because this is somebody who's willing to share their information. Your real attackers are not sharing because that's how they make their living. So we want to keep up to date on these things because the attacker does not see a security boundary as something to respect. They see it as something to work around. And that takes me to something interesting about a change in how attackers are working recently. Because we used to have this concept of targeted or commodity malware. Targeted malware people who studied targeted malware were really cool. They probably had tattoos, piercings, wore black, and drove a sports car. Commodity people, they're boring. The targeted people, those are the ones that you would see as the advanced persistent threats. And the commodity would be things like banking Trojans, Dridex, Dire, ransomware. Commodity is ransomware. Very boring, right? But we have the rise of the off-the-shelf attacker. Because if I can just use what's already there, I can avoid what's called attribution. Or maybe I can get it attributed to somebody else. Because you probably have read some news stories recently about so-and-so hacked such and such. And how we determine that so-and-so hacked such and such is because we look at their tools and we say, that executable's been used at this other place, and it pointed back to this IP address, and we called them Bob. Clearly, Bob hacked this place. But if I have a copy of Bob's malware, and Bob's malware lives out there on something called VirusTotal, who's to say that I'm not Bob? And that's very popular, because not only can I false flag and fake being someone else, if I am doing something, and I can grab an off-the-shelf tool, maybe a tool that a penetration tester would use, so it doesn't raise a lot of flags, it's still a tool. We think in tools, but we need to think in capabilities. If the same exact tool that the red team in your environment can do everything I need to do as an attacker, and you're used to the tool your red team uses, suddenly I'm going to use that to do recon and exfiltration from your environment. Because then, not only are you maybe going to ignore me, or maybe you're going to attribute it to somebody else. Because the some other guy did it defense is a really useful one. Which takes me to story time. So this story time is a true story of something that happened. Now this is an amalgamation of several true stories into one, but it's a good story. And I'm going to talk about an attacker that I've branded Harm Incorporated. So we actually track this attacker set. They're a real sophisticated attacker, if you will. That's not what we typically call them. But Harm Incorporated, here's what they do. We talk about TTPs, tools, techniques, and procedures. That's how you track an actor group and attribute to them. So the tools, techniques, and procedures for Harm Inc. We knew about this attacker for some time, but they were considered to be commodity. So we didn't think they were interesting. We followed them, we knew they existed, but we didn't think they were worth our time. But what we found out is they tried to do cyber extortion. And we found out because somebody didn't want to pay. So we can assume that these people were very profitable for a very long time, and people paid and just didn't ever bring it up because it's commodity boring stuff. What they do, what Harm Incorporated does, is cyber extortion, data links, username and password dumps, and credit card theft. And they've been successful at every one of those. And they don't do the same one everywhere they go. They may get into an environment that has a wealth of very valuable credit card data, but they're maybe risk adverse because they don't want to get caught there. So what they'll do is they'll sell something like a network diagram from that customer over here on the darknet. Or maybe they'll get a username and password dump from this place and then sell that. Or maybe they'll flat out sell the credit card data. They're very opportunistic. And they'll get into a lot of different environments. We see them in a lot of different places. Because this is on a lot of machines in the world. Through the ability to have the antivirus checking in, we can see where a lot of these places are. So these are not an attacker that wants to be a special snowflake. Because if you think about the targeted malware, if you're targeted malware, you want to keep your secrets very close. You want to keep your sauce as fresh as possible. Because if you put that malware everywhere, people are going to catch it, and they're going to catch on to you, and they're going to create a signature for it. These guys, they're sprinkling it everywhere like glitter. They're very happy to be everywhere. And they are in a ton of places. They're in everything from what we call Fortune 10 companies on down, according to their own bragging about it. They do well-researched attacks on the networks. That's where they exfiltrate that network topology to sell or enable things. They will figure out who is important in a network. We've seen org charts or HR diagrams as part of what they look for. All of it is off-the-shelf tools. Something called Metasploit, which is a penetration tester tool, or Empire, which is a PowerShell framework written by a guy named Will Harmjoy. You might figure out why I named it Harm Inc. now. And of course, they used Mimikatz, like everybody else. All of these things are things that you could go download, don't do it. You could go download and use in your environment. And your security team is probably using them in your environment. And they do that for a reason. Because you probably have exceptions in your antivirus or are used to seeing these sort of things. And they were far more interested in credentials than having a malware implant on the network. And that's true for most attackers. If I can get the credentials that are useful to me, That's far better than putting a whole lot of malware all around an environment. And these guys were good about that, because the more malware you have in an environment, the more implants, as they're called, that might potentially be calling out over the network or creating noise, the more likely you are to be found. You don't need a lot of them. As a matter of fact, you can have a 100% malware-free compromise, which these guys have done. If you don't have two-factor on your VPN or on your remote desktop type of farm, your published applications, if there's no two-factor there and I can get an end user or an admin's credentials, I don't need malware to get into your environment constantly. So they were very good about not using a ton of implants and being found. There were about 4 on the average network. But what was interesting about these guys is they piggybacked on another malware framework for their initial entry, a very boring malware network framework, something that you probably get detections for a whole lot in your environment and ignore, because it's a commodity piece of malware. But think about ransomware, think about the commodity malware. If you get ransomware and you pay the ransom, does that remove the malware? No, it doesn't. So there are a lot of frameworks out there that are potentially still running. Or if I think about a very commodity, boring piece of malware, I'm in your network. Maybe I'm doing clickjacking. Maybe I'm doing something very boring. Or maybe I've checked back in and I see that your IP address range is of a very large software company, and I switch modus operandi. Because that's exactly what a lot of this malware has been doing, is that they're able to figure out how to get in a very pedantic, boring way, and then switch when they realize who they're dealing with. Maybe this is somebody that they're supposed to go after. We don't know. We don't work in their HR department at Harm Incorporated. But the idea is that you can get in through something very boring and then switch to being something very, very targeted. One of the things that these guys do is they obfuscate themselves with PowerShell and Base64 encoding tricks, so that if you went out and you looked and you actually found the service or scheduled task or whatever it was that was kicking this off, it would be a blob of Base64 encoded data for you, which looks like bleh. I mean, it pretty much looks like SSL certs when you cut and paste them, that kind of thing. But they're doing that for a reason. One, because it looks like bleh. And the other thing is, a lot of the automated tools that will go out and look for services or scheduled tasks or whatever on your machines, they truncate after a certain number of characters. So all you would see is you have a scheduled task or a service that's PowerShell.exe, small window, blah. They would never show you the full Base64. So a lot of people just assume this was the desktop engineering group or whatever else like that. So it's very powerful to be able to do that. And occasionally they would pack their malware. Packing their malware helps you obfuscate it even further. But again, they were using just the packers that are available inside of Metasploit, 100% off the shelf. Most of the time, the detection that we have in our anti-malware scanner for that packer itself is finding a penetration tester or your red team. So again, even if they're obfuscating themselves and trying harder, they're doing it 100% off the shelf. And these guys, they get very comfortable on your networks because it's really easy to tell what you're doing. You do your recon. And a lot of attackers are like this, not just these guys. They knew that they weren't monitoring for event ID 7045, new service creation. So they were creating services as their persistence points. They knew they weren't monitoring for that 1102 security event log cleared. So they would just clear the event logs in order to cover up their tracks. That's what they were doing. And the attacker was so brazen that they actually placed an implant directly on one of the servers they were exfiltrating from. Because normally, if you're an attacker, you want your implants that are going to call out to websites or whatever you are doing in order to enable that data exfiltration. You want to place those on like a workstation, so the HTTP traffic looks normal. They knew these people weren't looking in a lot of the places that they've been in, so they just went ahead and put their implant where they were getting data from, whether those be file servers or different network storage devices or websites or whatever they were doing. They would put the implants directly on them to save themselves time. That was ultimately their undoing because somebody did start to monitor their traffic and notice this, but by that time they were long gone. So how hard would it be to become Harm Incorporated? Well, let's go to a trusty search engine. So I went to a trusty search engine. You can pick which search engine you use. And this is how you find out how to create a service using a macro inside of Word. It is literally the first result in the search engine that you would use. That was a joke. Okay. So this is how easy it is to figure out how to create a service from enabling a macro. And that is literally what they did. Somebody got a Word document, and it could create a service for persistence mechanisms for them. Well, what about this Empire thing they were using? That sounds sophisticated. It's a PowerShell toolkit after all. So they must have been doing something complex. They must have figured out a new way to use Empire. Actually, what they did is they went to one of the creator and maintainers' websites and literally cut and pasted from the tips and tricks how to start thing. They literally did that. They cut and pasted from a newbie tutorial for how they did their PowerShell Empire work. That's the base64 encoding. That's what the listeners look like. So when you would see a PowerShell service on that machine, you would go to services.exe, and it would look like PowerShell exe with all that different stuff behind it. But this attacker, what they did is they literally went and cut and pasted from a tutorial website. Now, if you're thinking about attribution and potentially maybe prosecution because they were stealing things like credit card data, I wonder how I attribute something that somebody Googled, right? Like there's a benefit to that. There's a big benefit to being dumb. So detection. What do you do if you have a problem like this, and what are some of the harsh realities of incident response? Behavioral detections. If you think about some of the next-gen machine learning type stuff that's out there, they're not really useful during an incident response phase. In most networks, if they've had a problem like this, the bad behavior is the norm. So if you drop a machine learning technology, whatever it is in there, it's just going to say, yep, business as usual. Right? So during the IR phase, these behavioral technologies are not usually too useful, and that was the case we had in these. But your attacker can sort out what is normal too. If you don't know what's normal in your environment, they certainly will. If your systems management agent is logging into all of your systems with logon type 4, which is batch, which leaves credentials on disk and in memory, that's how they're going to move around the network. That might be how they stole the credentials in the first place, because logging on as type 4 will leave them on disk and in memory. But they're going to do that. They're going to blend in. So if they steal an account, they're going to try to look like what that account does normally as they move through the network. And that's really easy to tell. Now for you, it's easy to tell as well if you do something like Windows Event Forwarding. They can figure out your audit policies. They will research and they will figure them out. If you're not monitoring 11.02, they're going to clear your logs. If you're having conflicting audit policies with advanced and regular audit policies and therefore not logging anything at all, they're going to know that. But most of the time they don't bother because nobody's actually monitoring anything. So there's a lot of places out there that are missing really key important things, like just plain old logons. I've seen a lot of places when we go and we look at the logs and we try to do data in an incident response, they do not even have plain old logon events for the vast majority of their systems. And a big gap that we see almost everywhere is that people are getting logs off of their servers and their domain controllers, but they're not getting security logs off of their workstations. And if you're not getting workstation logs, you're missing a big part of the story, because you're going to miss where that implant might have come in, and you're also going to miss something called Event ID 4648, log on with explicit credentials. Because if I steal something important like a domain admin account, and I do a log on with explicit credentials from the workstation, it only shows up on the workstation as a 4648. Otherwise, it's just a network logon type 3 to your domain controller, and that looks really normal. So it's very important to think about that monitoring, because a lot of places don't monitor well enough, and they don't get that whole picture. And know where your credentials are used. This goes back to the monitoring. If you're not getting logon data from your workstations, do you know if a domain admin credential is being used there? Do you know that the SQL team has shared their service account amongst every single system and every single integration job they have? You don't know that if you haven't gotten the data. So try to incorporate data from your entire environment. If you've got a SIEM, a Splunk, an ArcSight, an OMS, something like that, that's great. But if you can't get that agent onto every single system, start to look into Windows Event Forwarding, which is built in. So you can get that logging off of every system brought in and get that view. because that's useful not just for hunting, where you start to look for an attacker in your network, but figuring out where credentials are used. Because if you've got some service account that you can't decommission or deprovision or reduce the privileges on because it's important, you can figure out where it's being used and then figure out where it's getting the denieds if you have that wide visibility. And look for those new auto-start extensibility or execution points in your environment. If you have no idea what the services that are running on your domain controllers are, that's a bad news bears for you there. Because you should pretty much never have a new service start on your domain controller after it's built. PSExec. PSExec drops a new service onto the machine. If you don't get paged when PSExec is happening in your environment, an attacker can use it or an attacker can use malware in order to do those sort of things, right? So know what is in your environment, what is starting up with your computers, and why it's there. It's a software inventory of sorts, but scheduled tasks, services, these things like that can also be a really great way to implant malware. PowerShell profiles, that's a great way to get stuff that starts up every time with your machine. And you need to watch for those log clears. So if you're not getting 7045s and 1102s, that's probably what the attacker is going to use in your network. And make sure your audit policy actually works, because that's something that we see falling down quite often, is that people have an audit policy, but they've never actually checked it. And if you've got some conflicting settings, that may mean it works not at all. So check your audit policies. Go look at all of your group policies and figure out what you actually have in there, and make sure it's in there. Because this is really important, because as we've been thinking about, security and all the different stuff that's happening in the environment, we tend to think about smart people. We tend to be giving our enemy a lot of respect. But in reality, crazy people are coming. Because what we're looking at is we're looking at the ability for anyone who has a beef with you to hurt your network. The Internet of Toasters joke I made at the beginning, that's something different. That's the ability to take your website down through load. But if I have a disgruntled help desk admin, or not even someone who's in IT, and all of this stuff that I showed you with the off-the-shelf attacker is available, anyone who has the slightest concern that you might not be doing what they like can do things to you. And whether or not we like it, there are people who have complaints with every one of our companies. There are people that don't like Microsoft. There are people that don't like education places, whatever you're doing. Or maybe they want to steal data from you. There might be a person who works in your environment that's decided it's a little bit more advantageous to sell that to someone else. And if all of these things are available, you're looking at someone who isn't necessarily highly privileged or sophisticated being able to hurt you and do damage in your environment. And we want to be able to think about the inevitable breach and start to harden our environments. So that's where the network segmentation, credential hygiene, and learning about attacker behavior comes in. Because if you can't think like an attacker or know what they're using, you won't be building a reality-driven defense. So much of what we see as spending or as effort inside of IT organizations right now is not driven by reality. You might have a multi-million-dollar security budget, as many of the people we've done incident responses have done. They've spent a lot of money, but they haven't been doing it from a reality-driven defense perspective. So they might have next-generation network sensors or all of this machine learning or some sort of new endpoint security system that they've put in. But they might not have been patching. They might not have disabled macros. They might not have had least privilege. They might not be doing credential hygiene. And if you don't do all of those things, no matter how much money you spend in that environment, someone's still going to be able to get in. So we need to be able to make sure that we understand everything that's happening in that environment. Because if you don't understand the attacker, you're not going to be able to defend against it. Which takes me to my last point, macros, not even once. Thank you.